Well, hello. Welcome to the second Arlington Double Take Storytelling event. My name is David Swanson. I co-chair the Arlington Human Rights Commission along with Naomi Greenfield, and you'll hear from Naomi in just a sec. She's going to introduce tonight's program. And before that, in the interim, for those of you who are not familiar with the commission, I'm going to talk just briefly who we are, what we do, what our mission is, and how you can get more involved. So the Arlington Human Rights Commission is a 13-member appointed town commission. The 13 members are all Arlington residents. I believe at least 4 of us are here tonight. Naomi and I, Christina's there in the background with her hands up, and Kristen is right here in the front. If you haven't met any of us, there is a reception portion of the event afterwards. Please say hello, please introduce yourself, and we will try to do the same. So the Arlington Human Rights Commission was founded 25 years ago by town meeting. Our mission is to promote a more welcoming, diverse, and inclusive Arlington community, and we pursue that mission through 3 overarching goals. The first of which is to respond to and support victims of hate crimes and hate incidents in the community. We as a commission tally, categorize, report on, and provide direct support to victims of hate incidents on an annual basis. We also provide resources and support to anyone in Arlington who feels unduly threatened by local, state, or federal policies or events. So we serve that function primarily. The second goal is to educate and advocate for human rights related issues in our community. We do that through several different avenues. We've offered training and educational opportunities for town employees and commission members on things like cultural sensitivity bias, conflict resolution management. We also host educational programs around human rights related issues. And I think in this past year, we've partnered with the Arlington Police Department. Thank you, Captain Kern, for being here tonight, and the Arlington High School on a restorative justice community conversation. We partnered with the Anti-Defamation League of New England on a Hate Symbols 101. What is a hate symbol? What are the history of them, and how do they impact members of the community? So that's our education and advocacy component. And the third component that we do is community building and community engagement. And tonight is a primary example of that. What we like to do when we host events is not simply have a passive event, but an event where community members can either take part or have the ability to take action steps toward either an educational goal, an advocacy goal, or in tonight's instance, engage with one another in conversation. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Naomi.
Thanks so much, Dave. Yeah, and as Dave said, this is part of our community building initiative. So a lot of the times, you know, we are responding to things, and there's sort of a reactive component to our commission, but a lot of the times Dave and I talk about sort of the, you know, wanting to do proactive things in the community. So how can we do things that sort of get us to a place where there are less incidents of bias and less incidents of hate in town? And one of the things that often comes up is the desire to have people get to know each other on a little more less superficial basis. And so that's why we're here tonight. Everyone has a story. Communities are made up of all of those stories, and it's rare that we often get a chance to hear from people about sort of what is their story, what's something that has happened to them that has shaped who they are, or that is sort of integral to their being and what they bring with them when they are part of the Arlington community. So tonight we're going to hear 7 stories. They are representative of Arlington and also not representative of Arlington, because there's so many stories here. And the idea is that our hope is that you will sort of think twice, maybe do a double take next time you meet someone in Arlington and want to get to know them a little better. And so that's what we're hoping we'll do here tonight. So I'm going to invite up the storytellers are going to come up one at a time in the order that's in your program, and you have sort of information about them and their names in there, and then in the end we will just come together and hope everyone will join for the reception. So we have this microphone here, or we also have a handheld for anyone who would like, okay? All right, thanks so much for coming, and enjoy the program.
guess apparently I'm first. I just looked at the program. Does this work? No? This? This? There you go. Let's use this one. I guess we could probably just turn it on, but yeah, okay. I'll go with this. I don't know why he chose the words that he did, or the tone or the approach that he did. I can only guess that he's never experienced unconditional love, that if he had ever seen unconditional love, he wouldn't recognize it. The story centers in a small house about 150 miles southwest of Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. About 150 miles southwest and about 6 miles north of absolutely the middle of nowhere. We had gone there, my family and I had gone there to reintroduce our son, Samaritan, to his foster mother, Fatima. Fatima had taken care of Samaritan when he was, I don't know, maybe a year old, a little bit less. And we thought it was time to go back and visit after 10 years. When we first arrived, my family and I, back in Ethiopia, we landed in Addis Ababa, and we hopped in a Jeep, and we were driven down a couple hours down the bumpiest road you ever want to travel. We went down and down to a region called Silti, and we drove as far as until there were more potholes than roads, really. And at that point, we ditched the Jeep and started hiking up to see her house. And so we climbed up this very ruddy road. If you've ever been to East Africa, you'll see a lot of the roads are this reddish, brownish clay. Almost like, it reminded me so much of the people themselves. When they're out in the sun for a long time, they take on this reddish hue. And to me, it was such a great metaphor for this connection between the land and the people. And we climbed up and up and up this hill, down an embankment across the creek, up the other side of the creek, the embankment, and then up this long dry field for about 30 minutes until we got to Fatima's house. Now, Fatima was a sort of a smallholder farmer. She grew cabbages and eucalyptus and what they call false banana leaves. And she had met Sem quite accidentally. She was out one day, she had loaded her cart filled with all this produce to take it to market, and attached her horse to it and started down the hill. And somewhere along the way, the horse became untethered from the cart and had wandered off. So, of course, she went to retrieve the horse. As she went off, she heard a baby crying. And she looked around, and she saw a little infant boy crying, who this boy would become our son, Samaritan. She picked him up, and she took him home, and she gave him this name, Samaritan, which in her tribal language means found for life, which is much more poignant than the name I was going to give him, Cullum, which in the Irish language means the Irish American who feels compelled to give an Irish name to his son, I think. So she gave him the only thing she had, a little food, a little shelter, and this unconditional love. So we had trekked up to see her again, and as we approached, we could see her house up there on top of the hill. It was this rectangular structure, maybe 15 feet high, 25 feet across, made of mud and straw bricks. Some faded window, some wooden shutters for windows. And when we approached, Fatima and her family were out there ready to greet us. There had to be maybe 10 in all. It was Fatima, her blind husband, Mohammed, 2 grown sons, 2 grown daughters, a gaggle of grandchildren, and I think a neighbor thrown in for good measure. Fatima herself was a woman who appeared to be about 50. It's hard to tell with country people who worked hard all their lives exactly how old they are. But she looked about 50. She had very soft eyes, really rough-hewn hands, and wisps of gray hair sticking out from beneath her kerchief. And around her shoulders and her head, she wore this cotton gabi, they call it. It's a traditional shawl of sorts. And to her left stood Mohammed with his neighbor. They both had on these, as farmers often do, these sort of tattered sports coats with little mud and rips in them, and their traditional Muslim embroidered prayer caps. And Samaritan, my son, for his part, had on his traditional Red Sox jersey, day-glow orange Nikes, which would, were enough to scare a dog off a meat truck, blue Adidas shorts, and a big smile. So we nudged Samaritan to go say hello to Fatima again. And he went up and she gave him a big embrace. She hugged him, she kissed his cheeks, and she drew him close. And she hadn't seen him in 10 years, so she was very happy to see him alive and thriving. And she said, "I've been sick for a year. I wasn't sure if I was going to live or not. So I prayed to Allah to give me the strength to carry on so that I could see Samaritan again. And here I am. Now that I've seen Samaritan, I can die." And I thought to myself, well, okay, well, don't do that. This family is never going to have us back, you know. But so we spent the next 2 hours or so in Fatima's house. We sat on straw mats around the perimeter of the one room. And it was hard to see. There was very muted light. There was no electricity. So any light we had was the setting sun sort of trickling in through the groves of trees outside. And you could see the sort of dust floating in the air. And we sat there. She asked her grown daughters to prepare us a meal, which they did. It was roasted peas and this bitter melange of this cottage cheese and honey and God knows what. And I shot my kids a look saying, "I don't care what it is, you're going to eat it." Okay, because I don't care if it's crawling. These people have nothing, so you're going to eat it. So she said a few more prayers, and we sat down. We prepared to eat. And just as we did so, this stranger appears in the doorway. Again, the light is muted, so I can't quite figure out who it is. All I can make out is this big silhouette. And the silhouette and our host exchanged a few words, and then she invited him in. And soon I saw that the silhouette belonged to a tall man with a long beard, long robes, this Muslim cap, and a long staff. And for me, he appeared like maybe he had been the model for every piece of African art I've ever seen in every gift shop. Tall, dark, lithe. And she invited him in. She gave him food. She gave him something to drink. And he said a prayer of thanks to Allah. And here was a family who had next to nothing, giving something to someone who had absolutely nothing. They didn't know who he was. He was a stranger. He'd just come to the door, passing through the area, and he was hungry. And we sat and we ate. And at the end of the meal, Fatima leaned over and kissed Samaritan on the foot. It was a sign of humility and respect. And at this point, the sun is almost dipping below the horizon, and it was time to go. So we bid our adieus, and we went back down the hill, across the embankment and up the creek, and back to our Jeep, which we had abandoned a few hours earlier, and then headed back to Addis Ababa. And on the way back, I said to Sam, "So what do you make of all this? You know, what do you think?" He said, "I'm proud to be Ethiopian," which to me, it was worth the price of admission right there. So we got on a plane, we found our way back to Boston and back to Arlington. We were home about 2 days. And we turn on the news and we hear our leader referring to Haiti and some other African countries as shitholes. I said that softly because there's children in the room. And he said that, and I thought to myself, you have no idea. You have no idea that sort of compassion and love that these people have, this unconditional love. If you had seen it, you would never talk about somebody like that. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. dinner table at my house felt pretty normal as my parents told jokes and recalled stories of what it was like living in communist Romania as medical professionals and as Christians, which was a rare combination that made them targets for the secret police. A series of events happened that caused my dad to eventually be assaulted and almost lose his life, that raised the attention of a human rights department within the U.S. Senate, eventually leading to their coming here to the U.S. And that's where I came on the scene. I was born to my parents, sixth child in North Dakota, in the middle of nowhere on a farm. And having this background, I had a hard time relating to kids who had never left the state and for whom freedom was an everyday occurrence, whereas at my dinner table it was a luxury that we didn't take for granted. So this made me really curious about what Romania was like and what my family's homeland looked like. So when I was 16, I got on a plane and went to visit my family's home country, and after doing all the things you're supposed to do and visiting family and eating all the food, I spent my last day at an orphanage with girls who lived there, 90 girls. And as I stepped into the big cement block area there, they looked at me a little skeptical and not quite sure what to expect. And as I opened my mouth and spoke some Romanian, although with an accent, they quickly ran to me and enveloped me with their hands and arms and assumed that I wanted a tour of the orphanage. So they took me and showed me their bedrooms, 10 to 12 beds in a room, and their little corners of attempted privacy, whispering about the neighborhood boys that they had crushes on and showing me their treasures of little plastic jewelry and slipping little notes into my hand as the supervisory staff was walking by to make sure that I was following the rules. They just couldn't get enough stories into those 3 hours that we had together. And after just that short time, I felt like I had met my friends that I always wanted growing up in North Dakota. But there was something strange that felt distant between us, and I couldn't quite put my finger on. And yet my love for these girls just grew, and I went back year after year, and until I realized that the distance was defined by my privilege. And one summer, after we played soccer together on the brown dry grass outside the orphanage, they started asking me questions that revealed that this may be the case. Their questions included, what's it like having parents? And what is it like, what kind of meat do you eat? How much did your plane ticket cost? And where do you get clothes that look so nice? Their questions seemed surreal to me. I couldn't believe that they were genuine. And so the years passed, and I began to wish that this distance didn't exist between us, because I valued the friendship so much. So I prayed a prayer that kind of went like this: Dear God, if you could somehow remove this distance between us, that would be really great. And if somehow I could relate to them in a way that felt more real, please make that happen. And so fast forward into college, I was on an internship in Mozambique, and I was out for a swim in the Indian Ocean, and I was just enjoying swimming, and out of the blue, a current started taking me out slowly beyond what I could touch the floor, and after about 45 minutes of slowly being pulled out, I was exhausted from screaming for help and gasping for air, and was fairly certain that this was the end of my life. And in the middle of that despair, my thoughts were interrupted by these words: "Carmen, do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you, I will help you, I will uphold you with my hand." And at that moment, I realized that those were some words that I had been thinking on earlier that week, and God was using them to give me an inexplicable peace. And I realized that whether I lived or whether I died, that I was going to be okay. A few moments later, the same strength of the current that had taken me out, it was like this hand of a wave just came and enveloped me and brought me back to the shore. I found out later from the locals that I had crossed 2 coral reefs, which was evidenced by my bloody and bruised body. And they said in the years they had lived there, they had never seen anyone survive being out that far. So I realized I had looked death in the face and was given a second chance at life. So as I was going to bed that night, I couldn't help but ask myself, what was that all about? And why am I still here? I also couldn't help but think about my friends at the orphanage and if this had anything to do with it or how I would share this story with them. Fast forward, I got back home to college and had met the man of my dreams, and we had got engaged, got married, felt almost too good to be true. And it was. Soon after we were married, my life turned into a living hell. And I realized that I had married a serial liar who had a very good mask. And one day the mask came off, and I learned a lot of ways that he had completely betrayed me from the very beginning, including a very serious police investigation that had just taken into effect that day. And long story short, by the end of that day, he was on a plane leaving the country, and that was the last day I ever saw him. I felt like someone had just dropped me into this black tunnel, and like a riptide of despair just pulling me into this darkness and this depression that I had never known. It almost felt like this the storm I had experienced in the water was replaying itself again, but as a real storm. On top of it all, my church community didn't quite understand what had happened, and I felt very judged by many of them, and actually felt a lot of shame and felt isolated, which just made the whole thing a lot worse. For some reason, I felt disqualified from being human, and like I wasn't really sure why I was still alive, almost worse than my first storm. And at that moment, I realized that the same hand that had carried me out of the Indian Ocean was still with me, and that God was still with me, holding me. And I had an inexplicable peace that carried me through that season. And shortly after that, I moved to Boston, and I was at a 4th of July party, and somebody invited me to go with them to High Rock Church. And I honestly was not super interested in going to a church again. I was really apprehensive and defensive and didn't want to be hurt. So nevertheless, my desire for community and my desire to really reconnect with God was a little bit stronger than my fear. So I took the chance and I went. And I was kind of surprised. People were really nice and smiled a lot, and thought maybe this is pretty fake. And plus, if they really find out who I am, it won't last for long. But I was a little perplexed that so much smiles and niceness in New England, coming from North Dakota. And so I went back, and after a few weeks, one of the pastors invited me to serve on the welcome team. Like, surprised again, particularly because I kind of expected some kind of moral background check that would disqualify me, and that didn't happen. And after a while, I started to connect more with others and decided to take the risk and ask to meet with one of the pastors and just ask him for his input on a decision that I needed to make. So we spoke, and it went well, and I thanked him. And as I was getting up to leave his office, the sunshine from outside just felt like it entered my heart and just like warmed me. And I don't know what or how, but somehow the topic of my marriage and divorce came up. And he very tenderly asked me, do you mind sharing with me a little bit about what happened? So I did. And as I was sharing, tears started to well up in his eyes. And he listened with his full attention. And when I finished, he said to me, I am so sorry for what happened to you. And you are so courageous to have shared that with me and to step foot into this place. And I just want to thank you for coming here, and I'm honored to hear your story, and we're excited to get to know you better. And over the last 8 years, I've been just completely in awe that a community that has come to know me and helped me to rewrite my story in such a powerful way, that I've experienced an unconditional love that I didn't think was possible. Unconditional love of God and unconditional love of this community. And it just makes me wonder if this might have been part of the answer to my desire to close the distance between my dear friends in Romania. Thank you.
So I didn't always look like this. I'm not as young as I used to be, and I take solace in two facts about that statement. One is that none of us are as young as we used to be, so we're all in the same boat. And I'll get to the second fact later. But years ago, in addition to being younger than I am now, I used to have really long hair. In late high school, I decided to grow my hair long. And at the time, it was because I was just curious. I wanted to know what it would be like to have long hair. And so I started growing it out. And over time, as I was growing it out, it was frustrating. And numerous times I'd questioned whether or not I should just stop, just cut it off, make life easier. But inevitably, whenever I was feeling that way, somebody would come up to me, unprovoked, uninvited, and somewhat sarcastically tell me I should cut my hair. And so I realized I had a bit of rebellion in me, and my response was typically, oh, for you, I'm growing it 3 inches longer. So that helped me get through those tough spots. And I grew my hair long. It was curly. At least at the beginning, it was thick. Luscious locks, you could say. And so it was interesting to me, over those 10 years or so of having long hair, I got to see different people's reactions to it. And so I was interested in psychology and how we see each other and how we interact with each other. And so I was always interested to see how people respond. And the responses ranged from strangers, always women, coming up to me and complimenting my hair, sometimes running their hand down the back of my hair, and then complimenting my hair, which oddly doesn't happen anymore, to other reactions that sort of brought out people's stereotypes. And so I remember answering questions like, no, I don't play in the band. No, I don't have tattoos and piercings. Sorry, I can't sell you weed. And no, officer, you don't have to follow me aisle to aisle in the store to make sure I'm not stealing anything. Actually, the last one I just thought in my head. I didn't say out loud because I didn't think that would go over well. So my experience with having long hair was enjoyable and interesting. And one of the most interesting reactions to me having long hair was by a close friend of mine. And so when I met her, I had long hair and a goatee, was riding a motorcycle that day, had a skydiving t-shirt on. And so she later told me that, you know, her first impression of me was like, oh yeah, tough guy, thinks he's cool, whatever, I'm not buying it. You know, she was smarter than that. But apparently my personality won out, and we became friends, we became close friends. And so it came to the point in those 10 years or so of having long hair when I decided I was done, I was going to cut it off. And so over the years, enough people had told me how they had this burning desire to just cut off my hair that I figured I could capitalize on that desire. So I decided to hold a raffle, and I invited my friends to donate $5 to the raffle, and the winner got to actually cut off my hair. And so I used the money to pay for a nice haircut in a fancy salon. So when I actually got the haircut, I went from hair down the lower side of my back to the length it is now, basically. And I noticed a couple things right away. At the end of the haircut, I noticed that I looked in the mirror at the salon and I saw my younger brother looking at me. I was like kind of weirded out. I'm like, I didn't realize I looked so much like my younger brother. And the second thing I noticed walking away from the salon was I could suddenly feel sensations I hadn't felt ever before. Wind currents over my ears and like down the back of my neck and my head. And so I was like, that's interesting. So the biggest reaction, I obviously got different reactions after I cut my hair, from my young nephews thinking I was their dad and running up to me. I'm like, no, I'm not your dad. And then I think the most memorable reaction I got was from my friend, who I told you about. I got together with a group of friends soon after the haircut, and my friend Micaiah was late to that gathering. And so we're all hanging out, just chatting about life, and she comes in with another friend, and being the warm, welcoming person she is, she sees somebody new in the group and immediately comes up to me and introduces herself. And I reassure her that we've met before and that we've known each other for a while. And her face changes. Her eyes open wider, her jaw drops. I remember it as her looking me up and down and maybe doing this, but I'm not sure. But in that moment, I remember feeling competing emotions and having competing thoughts. One was, I can't believe my friends are so shallow that they would judge me on the way that I looked and couldn't see my inner beauty and who I really am on the inside. You know, have I gotten this wrong about my friends? And then the opposing thought and feeling was feeling very flattered. And this young, attractive, single woman was objectifying me. And I wasn't sure which one to go, but the flattering feeling won out. And so, fast forward a good 13 years. We've been married now for 12 years. We have 3 beautiful children at home. And when you have young kids, these are my experiences, you're constantly reminded that you're not as young as you used to be. And the second fact about that I take solace in is Micaiah's attraction to me increased as my amount of hair decreased. Therefore, I expect nothing else than her attraction to me to increase as time goes on. So, thank you.
So, why is middle school called the Fortress of Terror? Well, when I entered middle school, I had no idea why. I had a lot of friends from soccer, from elementary school, but then suddenly these things began to happen. The first of which was at a birthday party, actually, and the birthday girl had gone upstairs, so I was chatting with her mom, and Thanksgiving was coming up, so she started questioning me, and she asked me, "Oh, so does your family do Thanksgiving?" And I said, "Yes, I do." Then she asks me, "So who comes? Is it just your family or people from all around the world?" And I said, "Just a few close friends nearby." And then she asks me, "So does your family eat turkey for Thanksgiving?" "No, we eat camel." Yes, we eat turkey. And so things like this kept happening, but finally the climax was at lunch one day. So I was in the Audison cafeteria, the second row, and I was sitting with my friends, and we were just talking, and suddenly the conversation of heritage came up, which actually isn't a very common conversation because it's mostly just gossip, which it shouldn't be, but fortunately that is what it is. So we were talking, and then it was my turn. So I said, "Well, my parents moved here from Iran, so I'm of Persian descent, but I was born here." And one of the girls very casually asked me, "So, is all of your family terrorists?" And my mouth dropped, and my heart started beating fast, and I was just so shocked. And I had 2 things I could do. One thing was to tell them that's completely unacceptable, you cannot say stuff like that, that's crossing the line. Or I could say it was a joke and laugh about it like they were doing. But I did neither, because what could I do? Because suddenly I was the other, suddenly I was foreign and I was new, even though I'd known those kids for 8 years. And I just felt so beside them, and I wasn't with them. And so I brought this experience to my junior youth group, which is a Baha'i-inspired group in Arlington that focuses on bringing youth together from different races, sexual orientation, and bringing them together and having elevated conversation and having service projects. And in this group, I shared my experience, and one of the other girls, who's my friend, also had a similar experience, as she's also of Persian descent. And she said one day after school, her and her friends had gone to get snacks. And she'd forgotten her money at home, and she was joking about being broke. And one of her friends said, "Oh, do you not have money because your family's not white?" And she shared this experience with me. And suddenly there was a connection because someone else was going through the same thing I was going through. But at the same time, I didn't want anyone to be experiencing what I was experiencing. And so the group as a whole decided that we had to do something, and not just in the group, but taking it to our schools and inside our community. So we decided to have a club. So me and a friend of mine who also goes to Audison decided to create a club called Release Peace. And we started the club with help from my math teacher and the principal. And we had conversations ranging from humility to service to social media to friendships. But I think the real turning point for me was the service project, which was a fundraiser, which happened actually this Monday and Tuesday. And we decided to have a fundraiser for a local organization called Food Link, which I realized actually donated the food that's here today. And so I was standing there at 2:26 because previously we'd baked the food at our junior youth group, and we'd made brownies and cookies and homemade chapstick, which I did not know you could make. But we made all this and we ate dinner together and we brought this food to the school, and at 2:26 I stood there with all this food looking very tempting, and I was nervous because I didn't think anyone was going to come, because why would they come to this small club made by 2 kids in the 8th grade? But suddenly a horde and stampede of kids came running in, and there was dollar bills flying, and the food was being changed, and it was so beautiful to see not only our club getting involved, but the entire community. And I was just utterly joyful because not only had we done something, but everyone had done something. And so then when the fundraiser finished, we made $400, which was all donated to FoodLink. And I thought to myself, yeah, sure, middle school is a fortress, but it doesn't have to be a fortress of terror, because it can also be a fortress of healing. Thank you.
It became increasingly clear with each passing year that I was living a contradiction. And only my closest friends really knew this for a while. My close friend of mine, Peter, even pointed this out to me at one point, and I thought he was kidding, and it would take years for me to be able to admit this to myself about what I really was, what my real identity is, because I was different than what I thought I was for all those years. And at some point I was going to have to face the hard truth that I was a closet liberal living as a Republican. And when I realized this, I was just struck by the panic of, what would my Republican parents say? My brothers, my cousins, they're all Republican, and not just like a little bit, right? And so I endured years of internal conflict, kind of wrestling with this and working it out, and then the subsequent social conflict when it was actually out in the world and I came out. And this all came to a head on a very particular day. It was November 8th, 2016. And it was a day of reckoning, obviously for the nation and for me personally, because, well, I'd always voted Republican before. I always had my reasons. I always had my excuses, my justifications. I'd really worked out the logic of it, but it reached a point where it seemed that, as I was over the years slowly moving away from my tribe, it seemed that my tribe very rapidly was moving away from me. And so, I had already made my decision, months before. But, as we walked into the polling station, looking at the ballot and seeing that little oval, that bubble next to the name, and, it having been a conservative Republican growing up in the 80s and the 90s, you can imagine how, the most perfect political villain you could imagine would be a Clinton, right? And I had decided months earlier that I was going to fill in that bubble with that marker right next to her name. And at first, you know, when I made that decision, I was just okay with it. And then, but over time, as the election got closer, and I saw the stark contrast, you know, between the candidates and how right this decision was for me, that I felt great about it. It was liberating. It's like, you know, it's like this, you know, this was my Declaration of Independence, like signing this bubble with this marker. And it would make it official that I was no longer part of that tribe anymore. And so, and there was just a lot of, obviously, history wrapped up in that moment, in that bubble. And, you know, the first female president, and my 7-year-old daughter at the time, she's now 9, she was super excited about the first female president. I was excited about seeing her witness history. And so it was really a win-win situation all around. And then she lost. And it was devastating, as lots of people know. And for me personally, it's like I had spent years like crawling across this ideological desert from one end to the other. And I had built it up over those months, like leading up to the election, that like it'd be perfect timing, right? I'd be like just reaching the other side of this desert, and at the other end would be like this big historical moment. And when I got there, there was nothing but loss and despair, right? Obviously not just for me, but for almost everyone in my social circles, right? Other than my family, of course, they were pretty happy. And so I knew I had to take action. I knew that things had to change, and they would have to start with me. And so I enlisted. I joined the resistance. And, you know, so my hard-fought, hard-won political independence was really short-lived, right? I liberated myself from one tribe, and then pretty much instantly ended up jumping right into the middle of the other tribe. And so after 2 years of activism and organizing, you know, I found myself in rural Maine, of all places. And you know, so this was leading up to the 2018 midterm elections. And there was a group of us who were, you know, we were hell-bent on flipping a district around us. And it turns out in New England, there was only one district left that still had a Republican sitting in it, in Congress. And so you spent several weekends going up to that district in rural Maine. And Maine is very different from around here. They have a lot of guns, like big guns. They're loud. I heard them while I was canvassing. I did a lot of canvassing up there, knocked a lot of doors, talked to a lot of voters. And, you know, so I went up to one house and I knocked at the door, and, you know, there was no one home, and I looked down next to me and there was just a bucket full of rifles. And it's like, who has a bucket full of rifles unattended on their front porch? And another house, you know, I was walking up to the house and there were people in the backyard. I couldn't quite see what was going on, and I had inadvertently interrupted target practice that this family was having in their backyard. You know, it was like the parents, the kids, the long rifle, you know, and so I got out of there real quick. And then there was this one guy who, he was very animated, had very strong opinions about things, and he just kind of launched right into it, like in the beginning of the conversation. He said, you know, what we need in this country is we have to get rid of Congress. And he kept on talking, and so, you know, of course he meant like, you know, we need to vote the bums out and replace them with better people who are more responsive to the needs of the electorate. But as he kept talking, I realized that that's not what he meant. He was actually quite literal about it, that he actually wanted to like abolish Congress, like the institution, so that way the president could actually get things done. And so, you know, like the campaign, I mean, they give you like talking points on like what to say in certain situations. They don't have a talking point for abolishing Congress, right? for a congressional candidate, right? So, so my impulse was, it's like, well, I just need to get out of this conversation because this just is not going to go well, right? And my other impulse was to tell this guy that, well, he's crazy and he really needs to rethink this whole like abolishing Congress thing because it's really stupid. But I didn't follow either of those impulses. I did something different, and it didn't come naturally, at least not at first, which was I just listened. I just listened to what he had to say, and patiently, and not passively, but like, you know, try to get to the bottom of like what is it that this person really, like, what matters to him, right? Like, what does he actually value? And when I got at it, I mean, so I heard, I mean, I talked to him and did mostly listening for a long time. We talked, it was like 40, 45 minutes. And he told me his life story, his father's life story. His father was stationed in Alaska in the Air Force years ago, saw a man ripped apart by a polar bear. There was just like so much detail. And I mean, I know more personal details about this guy than I know about like most of my actual friends. And so, you know, and so I just kept talking to him, and, you know, and by the end of the conversation, he says, you know, I really like what you're saying about this candidate. You know, I like that he served in the military. I like what you're saying about his positions on health care, because this guy had medical issues that were very expensive. And he's like, you know, so I'm going to vote for him. I'm going to vote for this guy and for Congress. And I was stunned. I couldn't believe it. Because like how we got from like abolishing Congress to like supporting this congressional candidate, I have no idea. But it wouldn't have been possible without having the space of just listening, right? Like trying to understand what matters to this human being. And so, you know, I was on this personal journey, and I started out just trying to like just selfishly liberate myself from this tribe that had such a deep, you know, identity for me, and what I found was that there was this even deeper liberation in just communing with other people, whether it was political activists here in Arlington or like, you know, people like voters in Maine, and what I realized in this is that democracy is not a spectator sport. It's a lot more than just filling in a bubble on a ballot, and that community isn't a spectator sport either, and that the two of those things I've come to believe are actually very deeply related. And you know, with all the divisions that we see around us, you know, throughout the country, we see it in the news, and even right here in Arlington, we have our own divisions, which are a microcosm of that. And so I've come to think that like maybe if we could just rebuild the fabric of our communities, we could rebuild the fabric of our country. Thank you.
Hi. So it was after 11 o'clock at night, and I was upstairs with 3 kids when I heard the crash downstairs. My 2 kids, who were 9 and 3 at the time, were asleep, and our exchange student, Nak, who was 16 and from Thailand, was in her room texting on her phone. Now, I consider myself pretty cool under pressure, but I got to admit, I panicked. Let me set the scene. It was April, and we lived in Juneau, Alaska. The first floor of our house part of it was an unfinished basement, and it was full of the usual basement clutter and detritus, an unused treadmill, my late husband's tools. To top it all off, you couldn't really see anything down there because he had this brilliant idea to make a black light theater with our daughter. So you flicked the lights on, and all you saw was people's teeth and the whites of their eyes glowing green. And then you would trip on the heavy velour curtains he had hung everywhere. And now there was someone down there crashing around in the dark. My husband had died 6 months earlier in an accident, and his death had been front page above the fold news in our small town. Everyone knew I was widowed, and nearly everyone knew where I lived. And I still kept forgetting to lock the doors. Plus, I realized my cell phone was downstairs. And unlike most Alaskans and most Mainers, I did not have a gun. I looked around and realized I didn't even have a baseball bat. Suddenly, I felt a little vulnerable. So I just casually asked Knack if I could borrow her cell phone for a minute. And she had been immersed and had not heard the crashing downstairs. And I said nothing. I just kind of sneaked over, called 911, and whispered the situation, feeling kind of paranoid and feeling kind of ridiculous. And the dispatcher, what? And I can't talk very loud. There's someone in my house. So, and then she said she'd send the police. And I said, could you have them park down the street? I didn't want the intruder to be alerted, come running up the stairs to us. So yes, the dispatcher said they would park down the street. They would come in the dark, quietly. So we hung up the phone, and I strained to hear. I heard a little bit of shuffling, and then it went quiet. And I waited, and finally, I heard the door open. I heard footsteps, and then I heard the police calling out. And I heard them looking around, nothing. I heard them go up the stairs from the basement to the main floor. I heard their footsteps as they cruised the main floor. And then they came up the stairs. My heart was kind of beating, hoping it really was them, when I ran into them on the landing. And they said, we looked everywhere, ma'am. We didn't see anything. I knew they thought I was that crazy lady, and it was very frustrating because I also knew I had heard something. So they took one more look around to placate me. Nothing. So I cautiously went down to the main floor with them, and I could tell that they wanted to believe me, and they didn't want to leave me feeling unsettled and unsafe. They asked if there's anything else I could think of that had been amiss, and suddenly I remembered that actually that morning, the lid to the chest freezer on our back deck had been open. And at the time, I thought nothing of it. We have some pretty big and aggressive ravens, and I figured a raven had stuck his nose in it and picked the lid up. So I had been in a hurry. I had closed the lid, and I had looked around and found a big ceramic pot filled with dirt, leaned down, picked it up, with my knees, not my back, stuck it on top of the chest freezer, hurried the kids off to school, went to work, and forgot about it till this moment when I mentioned it to the cops. They said. They opened the back door, shined the flashlight, and first we saw piles of dirt and broken ceramic. Next to it, an overturned chest freezer. Then they panned a little further with their flashlight, and there on the grass, right behind the deck, was a big, fat, and happy black bear with a chunk of frozen venison hanging out of its mouth. Now, in Alaska, when you see this sight, your reaction is not fear, and it is not shock. It's rage. My venison! And I looked around, my salmon! You damn bear, give it back! So we screamed and yelled and chased off the bear, who stole the hunk of venison with him. And when the bear disappeared, we got to work. The police helped me gather up whatever wasn't too slobbered on to salvage of this wonderful bounty our friends and neighbors had given us after my husband had died. Venison, moose, halibut, salmon, so much love in the form of food had poured in after he died that my neighbors had had to carry over a chest freezer that actually we had given them a couple years earlier. So now we carried this chest freezer, which was battered and claw-marked, but still serviceable, into the kitchen. And I tried not to feel too satisfied as I noticed they looked at me with just a little more respect. No longer that crazy lady. And in the morning when my kids got up and said, why is the chest freezer in the middle of the kitchen? That was the first time I got to tell the story. Bear stories are a favorite genre in Alaska. There was one time a bear actually clawed its way into our car. We were not in it. And there was another time when we came home on 4th of July from a barbecue at a friend's house and saw in the back of the bike trailer where my kids' 4th of July parade candy was still sitting, a bear going, and just shoveling fistfuls of their candy, wrappers and all, into its mouth. My son wailed. He will still get angry when we think about that. And there was one time years earlier on one of the first camping trips with John before we were actually married when we had pitched our tent on a sandy spit and woke up in the morning to find a perfect ring of giant brown bear prints circling our little tent. We faced so many dangers in Alaska, and we did so many stupid things. We wandered around on exposed ridges in the fog. We would sea kayak in the dark. One time we crossed a crevasse-riddled ice field unroped. Cringe to admit this. We would go for long runs in the backcountry, navigating using an aerial photograph. We literally, my husband was obsessed with these and had a bunch of slides. We would literally hold a slide up to the light and squint at it and argue about where we were. And after all that, John dies running in his hometown of Minneapolis when he misjudged what was behind a barrier and fell to his death. So where is the pattern? Where is the lesson in all this, these messy, erratic set of adventures? I suppose you really should look before you leap, and you should secure your valuables. But I think really maybe also you should just eat your candy, eat your venison, live your life. Don't hoard the good things for another day, because you never know when a bear or fate might snatch it.
So there's a Jewish expression that goes something like this: "He who saves one life, it is as if he saved the world entire." Whenever I hear this expression, I think about Anna Koharska. Anna was a neighbor of my grandmother when she was living in a small town in Poland, growing up in the late 1930s. When the Nazis invaded Poland and it became very clear there was no place for Jews there anymore, my grandmother's parents encouraged her to leave home and go into hiding. And so my grandmother, at the age of 16, left her home and hid in the barn of her neighbor, Anna Koharska. Anna would come out at night, unbeknownst to her husband, and leave table scraps for my grandmother and her sister. My grandmother survived in that barn and in the surrounding fields for the duration of the war. Now, when I was 16, my parents took me out of high school for 2 weeks to go on a family trip to Poland. I didn't really know what to make of it at the time. Poland seemed like a strange place for a family vacation, but I knew a big part of this trip was going to learn more about my grandparents' history. Both my Grandpa Joe and Grandma Rochelle had survived the Holocaust under different circumstances, my grandmother in hiding and my grandfather in various concentration camps throughout Europe. A big part of this trip was going to visit the family of Anna Koharska. Anna had died a few months before we would arrive in Poland, but her family was still really eager to meet us. When we arrived in the apartment complex outside the apartment where Anna's family lived, Helena, Anna's daughter, came out to greet us with her hands outstretched holding a cake platter and this gorgeous 15-layer cake on it and tears streaming down her face. She presented this cake to us, La Torta it was called, and instructed us that we were to eat a slice of this cake at every meal that we shared with them. Anna and her family were very poor, but they treated us like royalty. For the entire time that we stayed with them in the apartment complex, all 5 adults in the family stayed in one room in the apartment so that we could spread out and be more comfortable. Helena would wake up at 5 a.m. to make homemade blueberry and potato pierogies for us and would leave fully wrapped large chocolate bars for us on the table to take with us on day trips. We went on a number of day trips while we were there with the family. One of them was to a nearby town where the Majdanek concentration camp had been. This wasn't the same concentration camp that my grandfather had been through, but as we walked through the musty, empty barracks, it was easy to imagine what his life would have been like there. I could feel the cold emanating through the cement as we walked through the remnants of the gas chambers, where the Jewish people came in to get clean only to never leave. And I could feel the wind whipping through my ears as I looked out on the surrounding fields, which were mass graves to the Jewish people. The next day we went on a very different kind of field trip, this time to the farmhouse where Anna Koharska had lived before she died. Again, it wasn't the same farmhouse that my grandmother had hidden, But as I walked through the area and smelled chickens and cows and pigs and saw fields of wildflowers, I could just picture what the setting had been for my grandmother all those years. We sat out in those wildflower fields with Anna's family and traded bits and pieces of stories in Polish and English of the stories that we had heard from my grandmother and theirs. I wandered into the barn outside the farmhouse. There were large bales of hay all around, and it reminded me of one of the few stories my grandmother did tell me of her time in hiding. She talked about remaining perfectly still as Nazi soldiers came through with pitchforks, searching for hidden Jews. And then I wandered into the farmhouse. It was small and unadorned. You could still smell the soot from the fireplace that was used to heat the whole house. And I noticed, it was cozy and cold, and I noticed on the fireplace there was a framed photo of 2 children. And as I got closer to the photograph, I realized I recognized the faces in that photograph. It was a picture of me and my brother. And I turned over the photograph, and on the back read the following inscription: "This is a photograph of Joshua and Naomi Greenfield, the 3rd generation of survivors who are forever indebted to you for your heroic efforts in saving the life of their grandmother, Rochelle Bunis Greenfield, during the time of the Nazi occupation." And just like that, this photograph of me in the home of a woman I had never met made me realize that this history of my grandparents was also mine. Anna Koharska had saved 1 life, but I was the world entire. I've been thinking a lot about that photograph these days and what it means to be the daughter of an immigrant and the granddaughter of refugees. And I've been thinking a lot about that torta. And I imagine the layers after layers as generations after generations, my father, me, my own 2 children, all here today because 1 person saved 1 life.
Well, let me invite all our storytellers to come up so we can give them another round of applause. Let me also thank all of our storyteller alums, all of the coaches, and our partners, ACMi, and our volunteers, and of course all of you for coming tonight. What we'd like to do now is invite you to stay for the reception. We'd love it if you'd introduce yourself to someone you don't know and share your story and listen to their story. Thank you.